Hi everyone, Cryptic Coroner from South Central Poland here with Rhyme Signatures, the nerdiest music review this side of being a very specific reference that only dedicated fans of Devin Townsend will understand. And today we're going to be doing a review of the new Afterbirth album. In, but not of. I want to make something abundantly clear to people before you consider pressing the play button on this album. You are either going to love this, cherish it above everything else, or run screaming from it, confused and possibly horrified by what lies within. This is not an easy album to either listen to or in fact recommend to everyone, even within the niche that this channel sits in and my preference for the darker, grimier and sinister side of the progressive metal spectrum. This album still tested my limits and tolerances for what even I find enjoyable. So, with that ominous disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the review. Afterbirth's new album, Is But Not Of, was generating a considerable amount of buzz in my usual circles. I often keep my ear to the ground for the hype train, and I've become accustomed to the shrill sound of its whistle and the chugging of its unstoppable wheels. And Is But Not Of was most assuredly pulling into the station where I was so patiently awaiting its arrival. I'm always most interested in these big hype records where I personally don't have a clue who the band are, as I can approach them with zero expectation and remain full of hope that the excitement that everyone else seems to be having for the album will be met for me. Now, I confess I'm normally a bit of an outlier on this kind of particularly brutal form of progressive death metal, frequently referred to around the campfire as slam metal. I've only ever really briefly dipped my toes into this kind of short, sharp violence, and my results and reactions to it have been largely quite mixed. So who are Afterbirth? As always, I do a little bit of digging so I can pretend like I actually have half a clue, like I know what I'm talking about, and I can pretend that I'm a real music critic whose opinions actually, mean something. Formed about 30 years ago in Long Island, New York, the band currently consists of David Case on bass, Keith Harris on drums, Cody Drasser on guitars, and Will Smith on vocals. But this is no Wild Wild West, no Miami, and certainly no summertime, and absolutely no one will be getting jiggy with it whilst listening to this band. I'm so sorry, Will. I'm certain nobody's ever made these kind of jokes before, but I simply had to get that off my chest before I passed out from an aneurysm. The kind of music that you'll find on here is the kind that I can best describe as being music to bathe in the blood of your enemies to. Yes, my esteemed viewer, Afterbirth, much as their namesake might suggest, are not a band to introduce your poor doddering old grandparents to, as they are most likely to turn up their noses in disgust whilst yelling "You call this music?" before chasing you around the house with a wooden stick and a copy of Nat King Cole's greatest hits to put on the platter instead. To try and adequately prepare you for this album, I'm going to have to ask you to do one reasonably straightforward thing. Forget what you know about vocals, and forget trying to understand the lyrics, as everything that you thought you knew about these things is about to go sailing out the window on a trail of vomit, blood, pus, and anger. Will Smith's voice is one of the most aggressive, vitriolic, nasty, and unpleasant things I've ever heard, and I absolutely, categorically, right hand on the Bible, adore it. Smith is doing things with the human vocal cords that I didn't even realise were possible. To try and describe the sounds that he's capable of were to be... Imagine if a bullfrog was gargling sulfuric acid whilst vomiting barbed wire, whilst being on fire. I can absolutely assure you that the vocals will be what make or break this album for you, which is why you need to go into this thinking of them as something else. They are an instrument and need to be approached as such. If you try to think of Smith's vocals as you would any other type of music, you'll probably hate them. But if you see this as a device for adding texture, atmosphere, and a means for accentuating the brutality of the music that it cruises alongside, you'll start to appreciate them in the different light that they demand to be seen in. So let's move a little bit ahead of ourselves here. A band, after all, is always more than just its vocals, and once you become acclimated to Smith's unusual delivery and style, you'll discover that the drums, bass and guitars on this record are really something quite special, and are honestly what most people will end up focusing on, given that they are the majority of the record, and are the most representative part of Afterbirth's frankly incredible sound. Tightening the Screws kicks the album off with a rolling, powerful guitar intro that sounds remarkably like mid-2000s Dream Theater if it was, being run through molasses. It's thick, punchy and immediate, denying the listener any chance to get comfortable before the band are pushing your face into the murk and mire of their own distinctive, sludgy, uncomfortable feeling brand of dank and brutal death metal. It's an amazing way to start off the album and leaves no room for guesswork as to what you're about to be getting yourself into. The record is around 36 minutes long across 11 tracks, so nothing on In But Not Of hangs around for any longer than it really needs to. It's the aural equivalent of having a rabid honey badger kick your door down, steal all the bacon out of your fridge, then shred your curtains to pieces before leaving by smashing through your conservatory and disappearing into the misty night air, leaving only loose fur and destruction in its wake. But despite this chaos, despite the unruly and destructive nature of the root of the music, there's a huge sense of technicality and precision to a lot of it. There's a brief guitar solo in second track Devils with Dead Eyes that feels like it belongs on a much more sedate, more intimate, and dare I say it, friendly kind of album. But despite it feeling a little bit out of left field, it works. It manages to gel within the context of the album without ever feeling angular or unwelcome. And that's honestly the best summation of the kind of music you're going to find here. There's a consistent level of brutality and viciousness to everything. Like the guiding rails of the band's ideas are always on the cusp of making you feel uncomfortable and dirty, but they manage to bring in just enough creativity and different styles, genres, and switch-ups to keep you guessing throughout the length of the album. This is especially evident in the back half of the record, from the track Hovering Human Head Drones until the final track of Succumb to Life. It's almost like listening to a different band entirely at times. There's these elements of almost indie rock, punk, psychedelia and space rock that play across the top of the underlying current of thick and putrefying death metal. To dismiss this album from the sound of its first 5 songs would be a gross disservice, and, well, yes, I do vastly prefer the back half of the record. There is certainly a lot to love in everything up to and including 5th track Vivisected Psychopomp. It's an exercise in savagery. It's the kind of music that I feel has been designed to test the limits of what I can tolerate in terms of pure filth. I've been a death metal fan for a huge portion of my life, but the first half of this album is so disgusting and so uncomfortable at times that I kept thinking I might need to take a break before my tolerances were truly broken. It is a great testament then to Afterbirth that Hovering Human Head Drones comes in when it does, with its staccato drum fills, big spacey echoing guitars and sudden drop in tempo. It's almost like the band are acknowledging that the first half of the record might be a bit much for the average listener who isn't accustomed to this kind of hideously brutal slam metal. Smith's gurgling filth is still on full display here, but it takes a little bit more of a back seat to allow the rest of the band to fill in the empty spaces with some genuinely creative and interesting instrumental work. This creativity just keeps on going during the second half of the album, with the title track being the longest song at just over 5 minutes, and the majority of this time being instrumental. And man, what an instrumental this is. The interplay between Case's bass, Harris's drums, and Drass's guitars is absolutely phenomenal, coming across as the best kind of Mastodon-feeling jam session I've heard in a long time. It's all incredibly well produced and mixed too, and Colin Marston should feel incredibly proud of the work he's done on making this album sound as good as it does. Every single instrument shines, and everything is clear and easy to pick out despite the chaos and sludgy nature of the compositions. Marston has made this sound about as clean and slick as you could possibly make something that is so thematically grimy and disgusting. Willow Tip Records are once again demonstrating why I consider them to be the best label out there right now for the harsher side of the progressive metal world, constantly pushing out banger after banger on their roster, and always making me pause what I'm doing to check out bands I'd otherwise probably never have heard of, because they clearly got their finger on the pulse of what's hot and what's not. So, what else can I say about Afterbirth's In But Not Of? This is a record that I personally had an amazing time with. It's entirely not something I was expecting to enjoy as much as I have done, and while I do love the dirtier side of the progressive metal world, I do also have a limit to what kind of music I can enjoy before I consider it to be a little too much for me. Afterbirth have skirted the edges of my preferences, at times teetering over the edge of what I will put up with, but then bringing it back on track only moments later to deliver one of the most creative, interesting, and fascinating records of the year. Now, this is not an album I can easily recommend though, as I can imagine that a lot of my viewer base will consider this an anathema to them, unable to make it past Smith's unique vocal style and the overall intentionally unpleasant stylings. But for everyone else that can move past that, you will find some incredible beauty in tracks like Time Enough Tomorrow, that feels like Tangerine Dream and the Blade Runner soundtrack fused with post-metal and space rock. The long story short is that this is an album that's worth trying at least a couple of times. It's brief enough that it's not something that's going to take up your entire day to consume and analyse. It's 36 minutes long, and absolutely worth taking an hour or so out of your day to at least try it and see if you can swallow a pill as bitter as this. As frankly, the aftertaste of Afterbirth is curiously sweet and satisfying in ways I simply wasn't anticipating. I keep coming back to this album, and not just the parts of the second half that I think are far better than the first half. I've been enjoying this back to back over and over. The first half feels necessary to bring out the sharper and more interesting flavours of the second, and I honestly feel that this is one of the most rewarding albums of 2023 if you're willing and able to give it a chance and make a significant move outside of your regular comfort zone. My personal recommendation is to pick up a physical copy of this one. It's the kind of fearless and bold creativity that I love, but this recommendation is certainly not an easy one. It might be more straightforward to give a curiosity spin on streaming services first, but if you're anything like me, you'll find yourself coming back to this one, curious to see if you're actually enjoying it or not, only to eventually find yourself reaching for the repeat button again and again. This is all, of course, guys, as always, just my opinion, so if you have listened to this record, please tell me what you thought about it in the comments down below. If you did like this video, please do share it around with anyone else you think would possibly enjoy it, and please do consider subscribing to the channel for more content. I'll be leaving my link tree down below, where you'll find all the places to find me on social media, as well as a link to my Ko-fi page if you're feeling particularly generous and want to help support the growth of the channel. But until next time, guys, as always, keep your rhyme signatures extremely, extremely odd.